Hello, welcome to Free Press Live. I'm your host today, Vanessa Maria Graber, and I work at Free Press. I'm part of the News Voices team, and I'm happy to present a conversation about local journalism and shifting narratives and resources. Today, we're going to feature two staff from Free Press who are also working on the News Voices initiative, Tauhid Chappell and Diamond Hardman. And they're going to talk more about the local organizing they're doing in their communities in Philadelphia and in the state of Colorado when it comes to building a movement that will transform local news and also make sure that people of color and other people impacted by racism and inequality are being given the information they need to make the decisions that they need in their lives. So without further ado, let's bring on our guests. First up is Tauhid Chappell. Tauhid is an organizer in Philadelphia. He manages the Philadelphia News Voices Project, and that is an initiative to reimagine how the city's local newsrooms approach their coverage of crime, violence, and the criminal justice and carceral systems. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Vanessa.
And we also have here Diamond Hardman. Diamond is the News Voices Colorado manager. Diamond collaborates with community members in Colorado to envision a transformative media. Welcome.
Thanks, Vanessa. Happy to be here.
Thanks to you both for joining. Today, we are going to have a conversation to talk a little bit more about why organizing for local journalism, access to information, media reparations is so important to the future of journalism. And I'm sure all of our listeners and viewers out there would love to learn more about your project and learn more about the philosophy and idea behind News Voices and how it relates to our newest endeavor at Free Press, Media 2070. So, Tauhid, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your work with the Shift the Narrative Coalition in Philadelphia. Who is part of that coalition, and what are your goals, and what do you hope to accomplish in transforming local media in Philadelphia?
Yeah, so the Shift the Narrative Coalition, based in Philadelphia, I'm very lucky. The coalition itself was pretty much created by the time that I joined Free Press last year, but the coalition itself formed after multiple community conversations happened, a lot of community listening sessions happened, organized and supported by Free Press with some community organizations in Philly. They went around and they talked about what are the information needs that are not being met in the Philadelphia media ecosystem, so to speak. And what were people's critiques? What were people's concerns? What were people's issues with coverage? And time and again, the consistent theme was always that the coverage of crime, the coverage of police violence, just violence overall, gun violence, was terrible, was bad, painted a negative picture, and was consistently, making people feel uncomfortable in the way that their issues that they saw were being framed. And so after hearing that crime coverage was such an issue and that it needed to be changed, and knowing that from history that crime coverage has never really been about centering issues of Black communities or other communities of color, this coalition of racial justice, social justice, media justice organizations came together to say, okay, we recognize that there is information needs that are not being met by the community in Philly. There are harmful narratives that people are consistently, having their issues with that are not being addressed by journalists in Philly. What can we be doing to kind of, address information needs, but also get to change how journalists actually cover some of these institutions that we know are oppressive to Black communities specifically? And so with this, the Shift the Narrative Coalition was born to focus on narrative intervention, building community power, but also to transform how journalists cover crime, police, and public safety as we see it.
Thanks for that explanation. And certainly there are many things we need to change about news, but Philadelphia especially has been experiencing an epidemic in gun violence and shootings and murders. As a result of the pandemic, that rate has gone on, especially the rate of youth violence. So it's not surprising that people in the community identify that as one of the issues being problematic in terms of media coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you all talked about in your latest piece for Neiman Lab was the sources being used, the people that are included in the conversations around crime reporting. And so if you haven't checked it out and you're viewing our stream right now, Tauhid Chappell and Mike Rispoli authored a piece in Neiman Lab that's all about crime reporting and the problems with it. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so the piece really focuses on the fact that crime coverage has always centered and uplifted the perspectives, the voices, and the solutions from police or politicians or people in authoritative positions, those that were deemed experts and people who had the right resources and expertise to address gun violence and issues that were predominantly in Black communities. And so you had a one-sided reference to what the problem was, what the issues were, and what the solutions were, when historically that level of centering has never been the center of the people who are individually or as a community oppressed by police. And so when you have just the centering of police who have influence and control of how the narrative is portrayed, then you get divisions of thought. You get a belief that police are needed to keep people safe because these issues are persisting, and the police are the only things that can address these issues, especially around gun violence and crime. And so there becomes a created reality that actually is controlled by an institution that is oppressing Black and brown communities. So the Defund the Crime Bee, as it was called, was to completely scrutinize the way that we cover police, that we center their perspectives and supposed expertise, and actually shift that to centering and elevating their perspectives, the voices, the ideas, and the solutions from the communities that are directly impacted and people with directly lived experiences, because they are the ones who actually have experienced police harm and know the repercussions and the impact that they have on not just them, but their family, their network, and their community. So our Neiman Lab piece was to say, we need to radically change how we cover police. We need to hold them accountable, scrutinize their failure, and really their lack of use in keeping the public safe. And we need to actually start formatting how we cover the center of the people that are actually directly harmed by police violence, by gun violence, and hearing what their solutions and their ideas are. And through research, this is all, we know the answers. The answers are already there. A reinvestment into specific services like mental health, like housing, etc. That needs to be talked about, and less of that needs to be coming from police.
That's right. And I think it's also important to include the communities most impacted by crime, right? And get to root causes of why crime is happening, right? Like the systemic inequality in our country, capitalism, lack of access to resources, white supremacy, etc. And we don't often see that in the very short crime reports in all media, right? Which is not just newspapers, but TV and radio reports as well. Tauhid, you're specifically working with the Inquirer newsroom, and you were former staff there, so you have a unique insight on the culture of that newsroom and the employees who are working there, especially the journalists of color who have recently formed a coalition to advocate for more equitable practices and a shift in power in the dynamics in newsroom culture. Tell us about a recent report published by Temple University from professors at the Klein School of Communication who did an audit and content analysis of the Inquirer's news articles from the last year, and also looking at the people who are employed in the newsroom and in various positions. And they looked at the content of these stories, who was being centered, who wrote
Yep.
them. And what they basically found was, if you don't want to read the really long report, although it is a really
Everyone should read it, though.
everyone should read it. I agree.
Read it.
It has a lot of juicy details in there. Unfortunately, it confirmed what many of us knew to be true, which is the newsroom is not diverse at all, and that most of the content put out by the paper of record in Philadelphia is stories about white men, even though in Philadelphia, we have a majority Black and Latinx community. Talk more about that report.
I mean, Vanessa, you summarized it perfectly. It said what everyone kind of has seen in the Inquirer since its founding, is that it is predominantly white. It centers and uplifts white values and white issues, and it focuses in the framework and lens of a white perspective. And because they do not have representation within the community, they are prone to bias, they are prone to discrimination, they are prone to racism, and it is all over the newspaper. Now, that is from a history embedded in racism. The institutional racism has existed and has changed and shifted as the newsroom has attempted to hire more people of color to diversify its newsrooms. The racism still exists. It doesn't feel as blatant. It is certainly sometimes subtle, but it is there. And, you know, the audit basically said that the sourcing is white and therefore the framing is completely off, that there's a lack of context and nuance behind connecting these systemic issues together. There is deep mistrust and deep disbelief from Black and brown communities. And the Inquirer needs to radically transform itself if it is to gain the trust back of the city and to, in my opinion, stay financially afloat at this point. So the audit really, again, everyone should read it. It really said that there's just been a failure in there's been a failure in community engagement. There's been a failure in allowing the community members to have a lot more say or collaboration in how stories are done and what issues need to be amplified or prioritized. There is a lack of good hiring and retention process in considerations. And the fact is that they need to start changing, the demographics of the newsroom, the representation of the entire company itself. And you need to do that. It needs to happen.
Well, one of the things I think that bodes well for what you're doing is that you've already built a coalition, right, for accountability, right? And really trying to engage the Inquirer and other newsrooms around these practices. Now there's substantial evidence, right, to what you all have been alluding to. And so I think together those two things are very powerful in terms of creating that accountability mechanism to force the change that you want to see. We're going to talk more about what you hope to see in the future when we talk about media reparations in 2070. But first, I want to welcome anybody who has just joined the program. You're watching Free Press Live. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and I was just talking with News Voices organizer in Philadelphia, Tauhid Chappell. We've been talking about his work in Philadelphia with the Shift the Narrative Coalition and the work that he's doing to shift the coverage around crime reporting in Philadelphia and his work specifically with the Inquirer newsroom. Next, I'd like to bring on Diamond Hardman. She's our organizer in Colorado. She's doing similar work with journalists and newsrooms, trying to engage them on many issues, but especially working with Black and Latinx journalists to better understand what their needs are for information and for equity in the newsroom. Welcome, Diamond.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Or I should say, welcome back, because we welcomed you in the beginning. Tell our listeners and viewers out there more about News Voices Colorado and your work in doing something similar, right? Which is building a movement to have more equitable journalistic practices and to make sure that people of color are also being engaged and given the news information they need.
Word. So News Voices Colorado has a little bit of a different start. Colorado is an interesting landscape for a project around community organizing because a lot of times it's at the forefront around this conversation around the local news crisis. When Rocky Mountain News folded, Denver really became the spotlight for conversations on what is sustainability. And a lot of what News Voices does is think about how equity is a form of sustainability for things like local news and really building relational relationships with people. So News Voices Colorado, we have deep roots kind of from Free Press and working with folks there. In 2019, we hosted something in Boulder, really asking these questions of folks. And then we launched publicly in August of 2020. And the external circumstances of what was happening in the world, we were in the middle of a global pandemic, we were in the middle of uprisings, really shaped a lot of the environment that News Voices Colorado was born into and really shaped our lane and what we're thinking about and what we're focusing on. So since our launch, we've really been talking to people, especially Black and Brown folks, about the coverage specifically around reporting on resistance or reporting on the uprisings. And what we heard way back then in August was that people wanted deeper relationships with the journalists in their community so that they could have stories that reflected their experiences and what they were thinking about. And that also provided historical context as to why people were in the streets protesting. And a lot of that had to do with being able to be in community and hear these stories and hear the specific histories of Black folks and Latinx folks in Colorado. So that's really where we got started there. And we've really been working with those communities since to think about what does it look like to build relationships and to have stories that reflect the nuance and the experience of your life, and also give you the space to think about, like Tauhid was talking about, the solutions that are available and how to get involved.
I've only been to Colorado once, and that was to attend Free Press's Media Reform Conference a few years back, which was in Denver. Tell us about a little bit more about the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations in Colorado, because there's this perception that Colorado is a really white state. What have you learned coming back to Colorado from St. Louis and doing this on the ground organizing with journalists of color?
Right. That's a great question. That's actually something that when we're talking about what stories do Black folks and Latinx folks want to see, it is around this perception of Colorado being a much whiter state than it actually is. Don't quote me on these numbers, but I think the last time I checked, at least 25% of our population was Spanish speaking. And then our population for Black folks is a little bit lower in Colorado, but we have a long and strong history and presence here. And also a lot of Indigenous folks that are in Colorado. So it's really been a lot of conversation about how is that represented both amongst one another so that we can find community amongst one another and so that we can build around these issues, and how is that the perception of folks that are in different places and nationally.
Now that you've held a bunch of meetings and listening sessions, if you will, what are some of the things that you've learned by engaging journalists on these issues? And how can we use that information to create a strategy to improve things like engagement and information inequity?
Yeah, we've definitely done a lot of listening sessions. And what I think that our most recent one, we're hosting this group called the Black Voices Working Group. I just got off the phone with someone earlier today, and we were talking about how there's not necessarily a lack of information from folks. It's more about connecting people with one another, and really this idea of like collectivity and solidarity, even amongst journalists. So, how are we sharing information? How are we sharing resources so that we all have the capacity and space to really tell those stories? And so I think that that's a lot of the strategy that News Voices is thinking about, is how are we connecting in different spaces so that the information is more easily accessible, and so that a lot of the burden and labor is not solely falling on journalists of color.
Thanks for that explanation, because I think that we're really creating a model, right, for almost like pausing, right? Because so much has changed in 2020. A lot of these resistance movements, even though they've been around for a while, are definitely more visible, they're more active, And certainly the topic of race and inequality has been particularly highlighted during the pandemic. So it's a good time for every newsroom, every media organization, even if you're not doing news, to stop and engage your community and find out what their thoughts are, what their needs are, and how we can collaborate in different ways. I want to bring Tauhid back on because my next question has to do with the future, right? You've both been listening to people, organizing them, identifying the problems, and understanding what needs to be done. Let's look ahead to the future, right? That's because that's my favorite thing to do is dreaming and visioning. You all are both collaborators on Free Press's Media 2070 project, which is a new initiative that was launched back in the end of 2020. And it really focuses on documenting this history of harm inflicted upon Black people in the United States by the mainstream media. And now you're sort of in phase two, where you're opening it up to collaboration and people who are also interested in thinking about what a future in journalism and in media looks like in the United States. Can one of you talk more about how that intersects with the work that you're doing at News Voices?
Word. I can start off because I think it's plays a big role in both Tauhid and I's work a lot. But I briefly mentioned our Black Voices working groups and our Latinx Voices working groups, but they're a working group of all the people that share and provide information for their communities. So we have journalists on there, we have activists on there, and organizers, community orgs, funders, the whole group. And what we're really thinking about is what are the steps that we need to take to be able to address the information inequities or the lack of access to news and representation for Black Coloradans. So when you take the Media 2070 lens around repair and reconciliation, it's really thinking about how are we engaging with the legacy that got us to where we are, and how are we using people that are most impacted to think about what do we need to be able to feel safe and affirmed and in community with one another.
Tauhid, do you want to add to that? I see you nodding along in agreement.
No, just wonderfully said. And really, commercial news, whether you're for profit or nonprofit, still, I feel like it's sold as a product and it's not a service. And it should be a service. Journalism and news needs to be a service. It needs to be something that keeps people informed and safe. It keeps people civically and politically engaged and in understanding the information to make their lives better, right? And as what Diamond said about acknowledging the harm and really reconciling with the past, it's looking towards the future of like, what do we want to build this? What do we want the building to look like? How do we want to work together to create something that's different, that isn't a industry that is baked into profiting off of harm? And like talking about Philly, representation. Black people making content and information for Black communities that speak to their lived experiences to talk about solutions is like, it should be that way, but it's not. It's still held by white people. The control is held by white narratives. And if the representation is not going to happen within these institutions, they're ultimately going to crumble. And we need to be able to create something that addresses the information needs when that happens. I don't think these institutions can last that much longer. We're seeing a literal shrinking of our industry right now. We need to be prepared to fill the gaps in. And that's why I'm really excited about, the work that Diamond is doing, because there's literally nothing there that can really address it. They get to build that infrastructure to meet those information needs.
Yes, and our word of the day is dismantling, right? Because we are dismantling all of these systems of oppression. And at Free Press, that's not relegated to journalism, because that is the News Voices department. But our comrades and colleagues at Free Press are dismantling systems of surveillance. They're dismantling media concentration and ownership, and they're dismantling monopolies and high rates of access for things like the internet. And so all of those things have to be recreated and re-envisioned if we truly want to achieve a multiracial media and information system that serves everybody, not just those who can afford it. Briefly, before we go, I'd like for each of you to tell people how they can get more information and get in touch with you all. I know some of you are on the Twitterverse, because I'm sure there are people that will tune in and say, I would really like to get involved with that. Diamond, how can people find you and learn more about News Voices Colorado?
Yes, I am on the Twitterverse. So you can find me at Diamond, my first name, 5280. That's a reference to my Colorado folks. But yeah, that's where you can find us on Twitter. And I also think News Voices has an email that I will give to Vanessa to shout out because I don't know.
Tauhid is always on social media. He's a great Instagrammer, so good.
Oh, please.
Tell people how they could find out more about the Shift the Narrative Coalition and the work that you're doing in Philly with the Inquirer and in other newsrooms.
Yeah, definitely look up the News Voices website on Free Press, which I will let Vanessa share out because I don't remember the URL off the top of my head too. But you know, if anyone wants to connect with me, find me, just Google me. I'll definitely, my Instagram, Twitter will show up as well. And we are in the midst of building a container for all the Shift the Narrative work. So more information online will be coming. So stay tuned for updates.
Okay, well, folks, you can find News Voices at newsvoices.org. Super easy. Don't forget
There
it.
you go.
Go to the Free Press website as well. Before we leave, now that people know how to contact you and get more involved, because we definitely want to work with people who care about this issue. We have a lot of followers and constituents in Colorado and in the Philadelphia area, and people that are working in media and journalism that I'm sure would love to give input, and especially if you're a journalist of color or somebody working in independent media, we would love to hear from you. So quickly, we'll leave people with some inspiration. What's one thing that's inspiring you for this future Media 2070 vision that we are sort of all dreaming about? Diamond, we'll start with you.
Of course. I think one thing that's inspiring me is how many people are ready to dream about it. When I talk to journalists, when I talk to newsrooms, when I talk to community members that may not have even been thinking about media as a system, we are understanding how it interplays with all of our goals and all of the visions and dreams we have for society. So I'm inspired by how many people are dreaming of what our future can look like and how expansive that means that we can build it.
Love that. Tauhid, what's inspiring you to do this important work and to achieve that dream of Media 2070?
For me, and I'll pull this from some of my other work in the cannabis space, but it's really actually hearing people talk about reparations and like seeing the creativity that's coming out of that. When people are angry and they're talking about like there is a literal debt that needs to be owed, hearing the creativity of like what should be manifested, what should actually come back, and seeing that, you know, in media and hearing media reparations and talking about how should the media industry as a whole really address the harms, it's been wonderful to hear more conversation around the word. So I always look forward to hearing people talk about it, and I encourage everyone to dream what they think the future should look like too.
I'm inspired by all the journalists standing up, who's not taking none of this mess anymore, and they are joining in solidarity, and they are sending powerful messages to the leadership that all this stuff needs to change. You know, of course, in LA and in New York, in Philadelphia, this movement is spreading, and so that definitely excites me because you know how these movements start, right? You know, it starts in one city, it starts going all over. Thank you both for being on the show and for the work that you do and for telling us about all of the things that you learned along the way.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Free Press Live. Come see us again next Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. And if you missed the beginning of the episode, you can find us on YouTube and it'll be on our Facebook page. And by the way, Free Press is hiring a campaign manager and a News Voices program manager. You can find out all that information on our website at freepress.net. And you can also visit us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube at Free Press. I'm Vanessa Maria Graber. Thank you so much for listening and watching.